Vampire Dawn. A full moon was hovering above Arthur's Seat. Flames flickered in a fire basket that overlooked the castle esplanade as a large crowd of people filed in through the portcullis. A lone piper was playing an ancient Scottish tune, and a lone figure was crouched on the wall next to the fire basket. He was crouched like a gargoyle, but he wore a black-tailed coat and white ruffled shirt. It was the same shade as his face, deadly pale, as if the life had been sucked out of him many centuries ago. But his hair was jet black, just like his coat. He was breathing hard, if he were breathing at all, and his red eyes were fixated on the crowd of people. A hunger was surging through him, a hunger that no human being had ever felt before. But this was no human being. This was an elemental vampire, a creature that could melt through walls and make himself invisible if he so chose. His name was Agenshore, and he was the head of a court of vampires that had resided within the thick stone walls of Edinburgh Castle for 600 years. There were 13 of them, all as beautiful as he was, all as beautiful as the day they died. Agenshore watched the people filing into the castle. Their clothing was beautiful and sumptuous, kilts and dresses, high heels and polished brogues. A shiver of excitement ran through him. Saliva began to drip from his fangs, down over his cold chin. He'd been waiting for this banquet for centuries, and now that it was happening, his dead heart was vibrating with an intensity he had seldom felt before. His red eyes widened. This banquet was no ordinary banquet. It was a banquet marking not just the start of a new millennium, but one which incorporated the 560th anniversary of what had now become known as the Black Dinner, where the 16-year-old Earl of Douglas and his younger brother were beheaded in front of the 10-year-old King, James II of Scotland. They were found guilty of treason during a mock trial. The whole thing had been orchestrated by the Lord Chancellor, Sir William Crichton. The Earl's men had been slaughtered at the dinner as well, and it was said that their bodies were buried in a crypt below the tower in which the dinner had taken place, a tower that was now part of the castle's attractions. The irony almost choked him. And then something did choke him. He started to gurgle. His corpse-like body trembled violently, and he gnashed his teeth together in anger and sheer disbelief. With a scream, he leapt from the wall and flew up onto the roof of the war memorial. He scrambled over the tiles and came plummeting down into the main square. His court were waiting for him. He glared wide-eyed at them. "A meeting! Now!" he hissed. The crypt was illuminated by flickering candlelight. "We have a problem that may destroy us utterly." He stared round the crypt at his men. "What is this problem?" asked Morta, his second-in-command. "Amongst the group at the banquet tonight, there is a slayer." The crypt was silent. "Are you sure?" asked Morta. "I saw her with my own eyes. They have sent her to end our reign." Agenshore flung himself into his great seat. "I knew they would send her some day. I was insane to hope it would not be this one. Just as we have been watching and waiting for this day, so have the angels." Morta laughed coldly. "And they think one slayer is going to stop us. Fear not, brother. They clearly have no idea what we are about to unleash. Angels do not make mistakes, you fool. If they have sent just one slayer, it means that she is something very special. We must watch her." "Of course," said Morta. "We will not let her out of our sight." "But that means she will not let us out of hers," said a vampire. Agenshore flew at him and pinned him to the wall, his hand gripped around his throat. "Do not speak out of turn!" he screamed. He released the vampire now and returned to his seat. Above him, secure to the top of the tall headrest, was the skull of a bull. Its great horns were still sharp as spears. "We have to kill her," said Mortar. "Take her out before the rest. Think of her as an appetizer." Agenshore was still pensive. He said nothing for several minutes. Finally he roused himself. "I have a plan," he said. Laurel Mason walked in under the portcullis of Edinburgh Castle, followed by her best friend, April Lewis. April had come up from Surrey to be with her this evening. They had booked this event months in advance. What better way to see in the new millennium than a banquet at Edinburgh Castle? There was going to be a ceilidh, too, in the main hall. "I can't believe we're here," squeaked April with excitement. "How long have we been talking about this?" "I know," replied Laurel, squeezing her friend's hand. "Just think, we are seeing in a new millennium. We are so privileged. And in this setting? It's going to be an amazing night. I'll have to write a story about it and put it on the website. I have 5,000 followers now." "Wow, that's amazing. You go, girl." "I love you. And I love your vampire stories. They're so good. You must dream about vampires by now." Laurel laughed. "Don't joke." They walked on a little way in silence. Laurel was looking behind her at the castle wall. Slowly she dragged her eyes back to her friend. "What's wrong?" "I'm just looking at that man," replied Laurel. "Which one?" "The one on the top of the wall. He just looked at me oddly, that's all. He's a bit creepy." April looked confused. "A man on the wall?" she asked. "Yeah," replied Laurel. "There is no man on the wall." Laurel sighed at her friend and pointed him out. "There, dummy, on top of the gate. Don't you think he looks creepy?" April had stopped walking. She was staring at her friend in bewilderment. "I told you not to drink that snake bite. It's lethal stuff. Come on." They carried on up the hill towards the main square. Laurel kept glancing back over her shoulder. Mortar followed her with his powerful gaze. A vampire slayer, he thought. She didn't look like one to him, but she had seen him. Mortar did not have red eyes like Agenshore. If he did, she would have screamed. He liked to hear mortal human screams, screams of terror, screams of pain. He would hear Laurel scream soon enough. He now turned his eyes to the woman she was with. April looked very tasty, he thought. He began to imagine tearing at her flesh, letting her warm blood drain into his salivating mouth. The piper was walking ahead of them. He led them past the cannons that were aimed out towards the fort, past the 1 o'clock gun, which would be fired later, past the Red Coats Cafe, and on up the steep slope towards the royal apartment and the great hall. As they came into the main square, April noticed that her friend was again distracted by something. She was gazing off into the shadows. "Are you okay?" she asked, now a little concerned. Laurel frowned. "I don't know," she said. Agenshore's men were scattered around the main square as the procession entered. Mortar was following behind. Laurel could be forgiven for feeling concerned. These men were all staring right at her. They did not seem to be disinterested in anybody else in the party. Why were they looking at her? She squeezed April's hand a little tighter as they entered the great hall. As soon as they entered, she forgot her concerns. In the middle of the great hall was a long table that ran from almost end to end. It was covered in an immaculate white cloth, and the table was adorned with silver candlesticks, flowers, bowls of fruit, etc. On a stage at the far end of the hall was the ceilidh band. "Oh my God," said Laurel. "This is incredible." April let out another little squeak of excitement. As soon as they entered, they were offered champagne by waiters in white suits and black collars. Canapes were being handed out as well. Their place settings were marked, and they took their seats after about 20 minutes of milling around and talking. A man, decked out in his kilt and Scottish regalia, stepped up onto the stage and took the mic from its stand. "Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and a very warm welcome to Edinburgh Castle on this remarkable and utterly unique occasion. We are here on the eve of a new millennium. Think about that. A new millennium." Agenshore crouched on a beam, high up in the ceiling's rafters. "I am thinking about it," he murmured. A smile slowly parted his pale lips. He could smell the blood emanating from 1,000 veins. He could hear the thud of 100 hearts. They would never leave this room alive. Indeed, nobody in this accursed city would live to see in the new millennium. The angels would simply have to watch in futile numbers as Agenshore unleashed his vengeance on the city that betrayed him. His eyes were fixed on the man who was speaking. He wanted to tear him limb from limb. He would be the first to die. "I suppose I should introduce myself to you," he said. "My name is John Crichton, and I am here for a very specific reason. 560 years ago, my great ancestor organised a banquet here at the castle. To that banquet he invited the 6th Earl of Douglas and his younger brother to dine with King James II. The Douglas clan had become so powerful in Scotland by the 15th century that it was feared they would become a threat to the stability of the nation. At this banquet, a black bull's head was brought in and placed before the Earl. This was a statement of intent and a symbol of death. The Earl and his brother were then dragged out to Castle Hill and beheaded. It is known as the Black Dinner. But why are we marking something so brutal, I hear you ask, on the eve of something so momentous? The fact is that I, and many others in Scotland, support what Crichton did. He was a man dedicated to the protection of his country, and as you can tell, he had a flair for the dramatic. There was laughter. Later, the castle was laid siege to by the Douglas clan, and Crichton again was credited as saving the day. He was given the title of Lord Crichton. Agenshore was seething with anger. The banquet got underway. There was the sound of chatter and laughter, and the clinking of glasses and cutlery that echoed around the walls of the great hall. Soon it would be their screams of terror. Crichton stood up and excused himself politely. He headed outside and across the courtyard to the public toilets. There was nobody else there. He locked himself in a cubicle. When he emerged, he went over to the sinks and began running hot water over his hands. He raised his eyes for a second to look at himself in the mirror in front of him. It was then that he physically jumped. He saw the reflection of a man behind him. He had not heard him come in, and he hadn't been there a moment ago. Crichton spun round, his heart in his throat. "Sorry. Did I scare you?" Crichton laughed. "Yes, as a matter of fact. Are you enjoying the banquet?" "Enormously," replied the man. "It's good food, isn't it?" "Oh, I haven't eaten yet," replied the stranger. Crichton frowned. "Oh, I thought everybody had been served." The man smiled. "My name is Agenshore, by the way. I don't believe we've met." "My name is... Oh, I know who you are. You're the descendant of that murdering bastard, Chancellor Crichton." Crichton stiffened. "I beg your pardon," he said coldly. "How dare you speak to me like that?" Agenshore threw his head back and laughed. "Oh, but I do dare." "What did you say your name was again?" asked Crichton, bristling with anger. "I didn't. I called myself Agenshore, but that is not my true name. My true name is only something I confide to a very special people. But you certainly qualify." Agenshore approached him now. "My name is William Douglas." "Ah," replied Crichton. "I get it now. You're angry at me because my ancestor killed yours. Well, you know what? Get over it. It happened a long time ago. You don't understand. I'm not some puny descendant of the Earl of Douglas. I am the Earl of Douglas." At that point, Agenshore shoved his face into Crichton's, and he saw for the first time his red eyes. "What the hell is this? A sick game?" Crichton's voice trembled with fear. "Oh, that's the tone I like," said Agenshore, grinning. As he did, his fangs appeared. Crichton made a bolt for the door. Agenshore let him go. He pulled on the handle, but the door was stuck fast. "What the hell?" Crichton screamed. "No way out," said Agenshore calmly. "Oh well, I suppose you'll just have to die." And then Agenshore did something that made Crichton grow wild with terror. He literally reached inside the wall. His hand melted through the stone as if it were soft butter. When it emerged, the hand gripped a long-handled axe with an enormous blade. Crichton screamed. He couldn't move. His limbs had frozen in fear. "I told a lie. I said I'd never met you before. But I have. You are your ancestor reincarnated. So we meet again, dear Chancellor. Only this time I have the upper hand. Have you ever been wondered what it's like to be beheaded? Sweat was pouring down Crichton's face. Let me show you. Agenshaw swung the axe with such force that Crichton's head actually spun. It bounced off the walls like a bowling ball, landing in one of the sinks. A wild blood trail marked its final path. Laurel stuck her knife into the slab of beef on the plate before her. As she began to cut, something happened. Her hand began to tighten round the handle, to the extent that her knuckles went white. It was as if a spasm had contracted it. She had no control. Suddenly a hot, prickling sensation appeared in the nape of her neck. She stiffened. He was there. The man she'd seen on the wall. He was standing right behind her. And yet she hadn't even turned around. So how did she know? It almost didn't matter. She turned slowly and heard her chair. Again he stood looking at her with those eyes. Who are you? She heard herself asking. He did not reply, but his smile became broader, if it could be called a smile. Are you okay? Asked April. Laurel didn't seem to hear. She was staring into space, and yet her eyes seemed to be focused on something. Her hand was still gripping the steak knife. What do you want? She asked coldly. Morta laughed now. I asked you a question, said Laurel. Laurel, who are you talking to? Asked April. At the head of the table, Crichton's companion looked at his watch. His friend had been gone for 15 minutes now. He went to speak to his security guard. Where's Crichton? He asked. I don't know, sir. The last time I saw him, he was headed towards the toilets. Yes, but he's been there a long time. The guard smirked. Maybe he ate something and disagreed with him. Go and see if he's all right, would you? Yes, sir, replied the security guard, and left the great hall. When he entered the toilets, there was nobody there. Or was there? One of the cubicle doors was closed. Mr. Crichton, are you in there? There was no reply. He knocked on the door. Mr. Crichton, what do you want? Said a voice. But it was not Crichton's. Neither was it coming from behind the door. The security guard spun round. Laurel, asked April again, what is up with you tonight? The party was still going on around them, oblivious to Laurel's visitor. My name is Morta, he said finally. It's nice to meet you, Laurel. How do you know my name? There was a huge crash as the security guard's head landed on the table, splattering the white tablecloth in blood. In an instant the sounds changed from laughing to screaming. The people nearest the head reared back in horror, and then another head tumbled out of the thin air and landed in front of Crichton's companion, and he found himself staring at his friend's dead eyes. And then a loud, almost piercing voice penetrated the screams. Now that I have your attention, it said. The voice came from the rafters above them. Everybody looked up at the same time. Agenshaw stood on a beam, staring down into 100 frightened faces. I trust you're all having a pleasant evening. He laughed at his own joke. I'd like to change the tone a bit, if that's all right. With a huge leap, he landed on the floor, dust puffing up under his feet. He walked casually towards the ceilidh band. The band members were frozen in fear. Agenshaw went up to a fiddler. May I? He asked. The musician said nothing as Agenshaw took the instrument off him. He now jumped up onto the table and slowly made his way along it, stepping delicately between broken glasses and upturned plates, all the while playing a melancholy tune on the fiddle and narrating as he went. It is a sad story I have to tell, one of blood and betrayal, of murder and malice. I was but a boy when I was marked for death, a lad of 16 when I took my last breath. The king had invited myself and my kin to dine in style with wine and sin. I had gladly accepted his generous offer and brought him a gift of a gilded coffer. But he betrayed me like Judas and cut off my head, and the cobbles were stained with a scarlet red. I was taken below and buried in stone, when my brother lay with me, so I wasn't alone. The blood from my body filtered down to the rock, and rejoined my soul like a sheep to the flock. But now it was poisoned with loathing and hate, and I became evil, the devil incarnate. So now it is time for my vengeance at last. I have sprung from the shadows of a murderous past. I am the serpent, I am the beast, and you are all nothing but a vampire's feast. Suddenly the windows of the great hall exploded inwards as Agenshore's men came crashing to them. At the same time, both Agenshore and Morta flung themselves on Laurel, knocking her to the floor. But no sooner had they done this than Laurel burst out from underneath them, sending them flying across the hall. Laurel turned to April. "Run!" she said. "Get out of here!" "What about you?" she screamed. "I'm not leaving you. I'll be fine. I told you earlier there's a lot of things you don't know about me. Well, here's one of them. I'm a vampire slayer, April. This is what I do. Now go!" April didn't move. Agenshore suddenly flung himself towards her again, but he didn't reach her. A huge flash of blue light hit him full on, and again he tumbled away. April turned now and ran for the great doors. All around her, people were being torn apart. Suddenly she was grabbed from behind. She screamed as she felt a pair of fangs begin to sink into her neck, but no further. Laurel grabbed the vampire and slit his throat with a knife from one of the tables. Luckily, it was silver dining. The vampire dropped to the floor and immediately disintegrated into dust. Laurel took April by the arm and led her rapidly through the crowd. She kicked the doors open. "Go!" she screamed. Then she turned back to the carnage. There were 12 of them left, tearing away at flesh and bone. Laurel tightened her grip on the silver knife. She was about to go after them when she realized there was a better way of doing this. She had to find cover and protection for the other guests before they too became a vampire's feast. Where could she take them that would be safe, where vampires couldn't get them? Suddenly a thought came into her mind. Of course, she thought, St. Margaret's Chapel. But the chapel was tiny, and besides the guests, there were all the castle staff. She had to try. There was no guarantee that leading them out of the castle walls was going to save them. The chapel was the safest place there was until she was able to deal with these vile creatures. "Everybody follow me," she shouted. "We need to get to St. Margaret's Chapel. It's the safest place." Hordes now began to follow her, running manically towards the doors, tripping over each other as they went. Laurel led them towards the chapel. She ran as fast as she could. But now vampires were jumping down from the roof onto the fleeing guests and picking them off, dragging them away to being devoured. There was little she could do. She had to keep moving. She had to save the majority. She reached the chapel in no time. She wrenched open the door and started ushering people inside. Pack in as much as you can." They poured inside, a sea of terrified faces. They crammed into every corner and crevice, even climbing into the window recesses. Suddenly Laurel's heart quivered. Where was April? She continued to usher people inside, but soon the space was running out. She hadn't seen April come in yet. Where? It was at that moment that she heard a shrill voice. "Laurel!" It was April. "April, where are you?" shouted Laurel. "She's up here." Laurel spun round and raised her head towards the roof of the wall memorial. Agenshore stood there, staring down at her. In his arms he clutched Laurel's friend to him. Laurel's heart didn't flutter this time. It stopped beating entirely. It seemed to stop for so long that she wondered if it would ever start up again. The blood in her veins ran cold. "She's mine now," shouted Agenshore. "But I'll make you a deal. A trade, in fact. You for her." "Really? Is that all? You surprise me." Agenshore grinned. "And I'll surprise you even more. I guarantee it." "What about these people? Are they part of my deal? Do I have your word they will let me go?" Agenshore sighed. "You're somewhat demanding, aren't you, dear?" He thought for a moment. "The answer is no. And if you don't agree with that, I will just have to drop your friend over the battlements." "I'm going to drop you over the battlements, you piece of shit!" screamed Laurel. Agenshore laughed. April's eyes were closed. She couldn't open them. She was silently praying. "Oh, all right," said Agenshore with another sigh. "If we've come to a stalemate, you may as well have your way. They will not be harmed. I give you my word." 10 minutes later, Laurel found herself sitting in the centre of the crypt, a bunch of chains tightly wrapped around her. "Comfortable?" asked Agenshaw. Laurel didn't reply. Agenshaw was walking round her, looking at her with a mocking eye. Did you honestly think you could just rock up and destroy me? Destroy everything I've been working on all these years? I know the angels were watching me. It was only a matter of time before they sent a slayer. But you see, you've come too late. And that's what I don't understand. If the angels could see what I was doing, surely they wouldn't have waited until now. Can you shed any light on that? There is always light to shed when darkness creeps in, replied Laurel, looking up at him with a cold stare. Darkness? You mean me? Asked Agenshaw, almost innocently. That hurts me. I am no more dark than any human. I am merely a few steps deeper into the shadow. He squatted down in front of her. Laurel could smell the pungent odour of death about his person. I was betrayed and murdered. My head was cut off. Do you know what it feels like to have no head? To want it back so desperately you would kill for it? He rose suddenly and went over to his throne, removing the bull's skull. He came back with it. This is the head of the black bull that was placed before me on the table. They buried it with me. It is a symbol of death, and I have now become death. He drew a finger over one of the horns. It sliced into his dead flesh. See? No blood. My ethereal body does not hold it any more. He studied the skull, running his eyes over its surface. His face now became bitter. I desire something that is more powerful than blood. Revenge. Revenge on a city that betrayed me. Tomorrow there will be a new dawn, but it will be the dawn of the elemental vampire. Before the sun rises I will unleash hell on all of you. Laurel scoffed. Really? How do you propose to do that? Agenshaw grinned broadly. I'm glad you asked, because I've been dying to tell you. He stood up now. He spread his arms wide and shouted, Come forth, you spawns of evil! Come forth from the earth that entombed you! Come forth, my children, and do my bidding! The entire crypt began to tremble. Stones began to break away from the rock as wisps of something demonic filtered out into the crypt. There were hundreds of them. She could not count. They appeared as wraith-like forms, writhing and screaming, their torment an overpowering hunger. Look at them, shouted Agenshaw. Look what I've created. A family, nay, an army. An army that will rid this city of its human dwellers and make way for a new civilization. These elementals are ruthless. They have no feeling. They are formed from our victims over the centuries, soldiers, staff and visitors. Each human life that these wraiths take will be reborn to darkness. My army will increase tenfold. From here they will spread out over the country, taking down each city, each town, each village. I will turn this entire island into a vampire stronghold. He stared down into her eyes. This is my revenge. He spoke to the wraiths now. I send you forth into the capital. Tear it apart. The elementals streamed out through the walls of the crypt. They spilled over the castle rock like misty water and flooded the surrounding area. Agenshaw had disappeared too, leaving Laurel alone in the crypt. There was no hope. Or was there? A vampire stood guard over April. He was crouched on the wall next to her. The millennium was approaching, and so was his dinner.
It's over for you,
he smirked.
You don't exist anymore. You are literally a ticking clock.
The vampire came up close and whispered at her.
I can hear your inner workings. In 20 minutes, your time is up. And that goes for your friend, too, if she hasn't already dead. Perhaps Agenshaw will let her see in the new year.
He stuck out a red tongue and traced his lips with it.
I am so hungry. Maybe I could take just one little bite.
The vampire suddenly lunged forward and bit into April's arm. She screamed in agony and terror. But no sooner had the vampire bitten her than he backed off, spitting and grimacing.
Ugh,
it said. What's wrong? Don't I taste nice? Screamed April.
You taste sweet.
Yeah, I'm diabetic. Shit happens. The vampire hissed at her. I guess you're not ready for dessert.
I say we start eating them now.
Agenshaw told us to wait, said another vampire.
I don't care what Agenshaw said. I'm changing the order.
He looked April up and down in disgust.
And the menu.
The vampires now began to move in for the kill. Suddenly there was light all around them, but it wasn't sunlight. It was a bright white light that blinded the vampires, burning into their dead eyes. They screamed in mortal fear as the angel seemed to spring up out of the ground. She was enormous, 8 feet tall, with long flowing hair and robes. In her light the vampires disintegrated into dust, a dust that blew out over the castle ramparts and floated harmlessly towards the crowds on Princess Street. The hordes of people who jostled and danced in the street and in the gardens were completely unaware of what was going on above them, or around them, because they could not see the elemental eating machines that were now amongst them. And in the next second, revellers began to dance even more wildly than they had been, or at least that's what it looked like to start with. And then the limbs began to be ripped, and the blood was spraying, and the screams of fun turned into screams of terror. Laurel ran above ground to find people streaming out of the gates and away down to the town. "No!" she screamed. "They are not safe even out there!" The angel rose high above the castle. She spread her arms and began to sing. Agenshaw whipped his head round. He stared in disbelief at the vision, and then he answered the call. Angrily he scrambled over the trees in Prince Street Garden and came scampering up the great rock. He clambered over the edge of the walls. As he did so, he grasped at the 1 o'clock gun and began pulling himself over the missile. "Oops," said a voice. "Wrong way." April pulled the cord at the back of the cannon, and it went off with a huge bang and flash. Agenshaw burst out into mid-air and fell head-first towards the ground. April wiped sweat from her brow and turned away. "Arsehole," she said. And then something grabbed her from behind. It clung onto her like a limpet. "Now that was uncalled for," said Agenshaw. "You see, the problem with me is I take things very personally. I always have. I guess it's something I'll have to work on. The other problem about me is that a puny little gun like that isn't going to destroy me. Unlucky for you, my dear. Very unlucky." And with that, he sunk his teeth into April's neck. She was paralyzed as he dragged her to the ground, his teeth still inside her. She felt like a gazelle being killed by a lion. And just like those cases, it was over very quickly. Agenshaw laid her on the ground and stood up. He looked down upon her, his lips bright red. He was breathing hard. "I haven't felt that good in a long while, my dear. We must do it again sometime." He walked round her corpse, admiring it like a hunter looks at a trophy. And then, sensing something behind him, he turned. Laurel was standing there, on the other side of Mons Meg. It was as if she was leaning on it for support. And suddenly her face was in shock. "Oh dear," said Agenshaw in a mocking tone. "Have I taken something away from you? Something precious that you valued?" "Well, on my own defense, she attacked me first. It was really her own fault. Sorry." Tears began to stream down Laurel's face. And then she broke. "You bastard!" she screamed. Agenshaw doubled up now with laughter. Laurel's face twisted into a look of utter hatred and rage. "You see," said Agenshaw, "I will always have the last laugh. Sorry to disappoint you, but that's not going to happen." She raised her right hand above her head. Agenshaw immediately stopped laughing. In her grasp was the bull skull. For a moment he stared at it, then locked eyes with Laurel. The clock behind the cannon chimed midnight. "Happy Millennium," she said. And with that she threw the skull over the parapet. It fell fast before smashing against an outcropping of rock and splintering into pieces. The crowds on Princess Street erupted into cheers, and the fireworks exploded on Cartel Hill. Laurel stared. Before her on the gravels lay a pile of ash. But now her gaze fell upon the other thing that lay on the ground. She ran forwards and knelt down next to the body of her best friend. Fresh tears streamed down her face. "April," she said, beginning to shake her. "Wake up! Wake up, my pumpkin! He's dead! Agenshore is dead! I took away his life force." Laurel gritted her teeth. It occurred to me that that was the source which kept him going, the symbol of death, and that if I destroyed that I would destroy him. To destroy him is to destroy all the evil that he has created. No more army, no more revenge. She started to sob. "I wish this was a dream," she wailed, "and that you were not dead, but alive and well. You can't leave me like this at the edge of a new millennium. You can't do it, April, you can't." She suddenly squeezed her eyes shut. "Wake up, Laurel. Wake up. You were dreaming. Wake up." Laurel opened her eyes. They were wet from crying. She didn't know where she was. Somebody was standing over her. "Laurel, are you getting up or what? It's nearly 6 o'clock. We've got to get ready." Laurel sat up slowly. She stared up at April, who had her hair in a towel. "Oh my God, I just had the most vivid dream. I was a vampire slayer." April shook her head. "Oh, Laurel, you and your vampire stories.